To get a conceptual understanding of a virtual machine manager like WSL, we need to understand how an operating system works. When we turn on a computer, the bootloader will load the Linux kernel into memory. The Intel processor will then invoke the kernel code every few nanoseconds, as shown in the diagram. At the first invocation, the kernel sets the infrastructure to create and run Unix processes. For example, it will set up the process table in memory to track and manage processes. It will set up the file descriptor table to manage the file system. It will set up the interrupt handlers to handle mouse, keyboard, etc. Then the kernel will create the first process called init-d. This means that the kernel will create an entry for init-d in the process table and cause the CPU to run the init-d code. The init-d code itself might invoke code from the Linux kernel to create more processes or to access hardware like hard disk, etc. When a process like init-d invokes code from the Linux kernel, we say that a system call has been made. After some time, the processor will pause the currently running process, say init-d, and again transfer control to the kernel. This time around, the kernel code will look at the process table and decide which process to load and run. This cycle runs forever. That is, the processor invokes the kernel every few nanoseconds. Then the kernel looks at its process table and decides on which Unix process to load and run. And then again the processor will cause the currently running process to pause and invoke the kernel code. A virtual machine manager has to mimic this behavior of the CPU. A virtual machine manager creates virtual CPUs, and each CPU works with an operating system kernel, which in turn will manage its own process table.